Привет всем. Следующий доклад будет на английском. Желательно, если вы хотите задать вопросы, чтобы они тоже были на английском, но если они будут на русском, тоже ничего страшного. Мы что-нибудь придумаем с этим. Для меня большая честь представить моего друга, который работает в компании «Галия» и в рамках своей работы занимается работой в комитете небезызвестном, который называется TC39. Он работает в команде компиляторов. И давайте пригласим его на сцену. Уджвал Шарма.
Hello. Okay, this works. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Dobry вечер. And welcome to my presentation. So, TC39 Demystified. A lot of boring stuff. Hope nobody leaves. We'll lock the doors. And thank you for everyone for attending. But first of all, because I have to make this about me, I'm Ujjwal. I go on the internet as Riza Kukin, if you find that easier to pronounce somehow. I am a compiler's hacker at Igalia, as Sergey was saying, and I am a TC39 delegate, which is what I'm going to talk about. I also am the editor of ECMA 402. If you don't know what this document is all about, don't worry, I've got you covered. And I work on Node and V8, a bunch of other stuff. So, wait, that does not work. I need to go down for the clickers. It skips some of my slides. Can we press space somehow on this? Ah, yeah. So a little bit about Igalia, who we are. I feel a few of you might not know. So we are a software consultancy with headquarters in Spain, and we exclusively work on free software. So that includes my work, for example, working on TC39 and W3C and similar organizations. We work on a number of web browsers, including WebKit, which is Safari, Chromium, Firefox, all that stuff. And my team also works on compilers for JavaScript or WebAssembly. We also work on these web standards. So it still needs to go down. OK, thank you. But this is JavaScript. This is, skip the boring stuff. This is what we're here for. And more importantly, as what I like to call it, could you please progress the slides? ECMAScript. But what is ECMAScript? Why is it ECMAScript? And who is this body of developers who decide how the language goes on and progresses? So it's TC39. Why is it TC39? What does it mean? Because one thing that I get a lot is that when I say TC39, it doesn't mean anything. So why are we TC39 and what does it mean? TC39 is an ECMA technical committee. ECMA here stands for European Computers Manufacturers Association. So it started out as an association of computer manufacturers. Now it's not so much about that. Now it's all about JavaScript and the web. We design this ECMAScript language, or as cool people call it, JavaScript language, and its standard API. It's done in 3 specifications. So there's ECMA 262, which has the core language and its standard library. There is ECMA 402, which, as I was saying, I'm the editor of. Thank you. It's specifically about internationalization, and ECMA 404, which is our favorite JSON. I have a question for you all. Do any of you know why the language itself is divided in 2 parts? Why is ECMA 262 and 402 separate? Any takers? Anybody? No? OK. Fun fact, ECMAScript has a bunch of internationalization features that you might not know about. And these features, unfortunately, require a lot of language data. It needs a lot of data about time zones, about currencies, and so on, which is quite heavy, especially if you're building a JavaScript compilers that run on really tiny devices, like a smart microwave. So this is why it's a separate specification. It can be excluded from certain implementations where it doesn't make sense. So if your smart toaster doesn't talk to you in Russian, that is probably why. We have different subgroups within this committee. So we have TG2, which is Task Group 2 for internationalization, and TG3 for security. If you know about it, okay, another question, maybe somebody knows this one. Does anybody know what SES is and what it stands for and what it does? Do you want to answer? We can wait. Okay, drum roll.
SES stands for Secure ECMAScript, which
Yes.
means it's a subset of ECMAScript with the more secure nature.
Exactly. And so JavaScript has all these functionalities which are great for writing web applications, for example, but they might violate a user's privacy. And when running JavaScript in certain environments, like on the blockchain, it's necessary to have a smaller subset that only has the useful parts, so to say. So this is what this body does. There is also an inclusion ad hoc group where, which I am a part of, where we decide how to make TC39 more inclusive to more people, like this, hopefully. And hopefully, by the end of this presentation, you will know better about how to get involved and feel more comfortable around the different processes and how it works. So who is TC39? TC39 has a bunch of delegates. These delegates are from different member companies. And this includes implementers, people who build browsers, like people who work at Google, Apple, Mozilla. There's large websites here. So Bloomberg and PayPal, they don't have any browsers, but they still build large websites. I mean, PayPal, for example, is a huge website, and it writes a lot of JavaScript. And there's academics. So actually, there's a number of universities who are also involved in this. As an example, one of our fellow delegates, Jason Choi, who builds a lot of great proposals, by the way, is from the University of Michigan. There is also the OpenJS Foundation, which represents the open source community of JavaScript. It represents Node.js and Electron and so on. There's a bunch of invited experts. So fun part, invited experts include people who are subject matter experts. So there's experts who are, for example, experts of dates and times and other boring things. And there are community representatives, people who are very active in the community and who can talk to developers and put their ideas back to the committee. So for example, Sergey, the person sitting in this room, is, by the way, the only TC39 member, attendee who is from Russia, is an invited expert. And then there's contributors who work on different proposals with us and the greater JavaScript community. So you're all also technically involved. Can we move down, please? Just a second. Anytime now. Oh, okay. Thank you. Where? So where do these things happen? Now there is a down. And yeah, so there is a GitHub repository where most of our work happens. It's called ECMA 262 after the spec. And it's interesting because JavaScript, the language that we all love, hopefully, and not hate, is just a bunch of text files that are written together by a bunch of people. And if you move down again, you will see the repository of ECMA 402, which is also a bunch of text that is written down by a bunch of people. But what is happening here? So everything that changes in the JavaScript language happens via pull request to this standards GitHub repository. There's, first of all, meta and markup changes. These are changes that don't really change anything within the spec itself. And there are editorial changes. So these are special because they're changes that change how the language is specified, but not the language itself, right? So you might write how a function is specified in a very convoluted way, and then nobody can read it. Congratulations. But then you can change it. And so these changes are governed by the editor group or a number of editors, like I am. And they can make these changes, make the text more readable, more understandable for everybody. Then there are normative changes. Now, these are the fun ones because normative changes actually change the JavaScript language. And they can change how the language works and add important features. But some of these normative changes, unfortunately, or fortunately, are too complicated and they add too much. So it's very hard to be binary on these changes, right? If a change is very simple, you can say, okay, this is good, or no, this is bad. But if a change is very nuanced, you might say, okay, let's think about it, or let's design this further. So these bigger changes actually happen via proposals. So there's many proposals in JavaScript, and you can follow these proposals that add big features like temporal or pipeline operator, or small changes that add a single property or a single function. Each proposal has authors and champions. Authors are the people who write these proposals and who are responsible for them. And champions, the way I like to describe champions is that I think in the Middle Ages, there were lawsuits, but there was no law. So when two parties couldn't decide what to do, they would each hire a person to fight the other person. And these people would go out with swords and fight each other. And champions are kind of like that. They are the people who represent the authors in front of the entire committee. And there is a fair bunch of fighting involved. So no swords, though. It would have been more cool with swords, though. There is a long stage process for these proposals. So they go from stage 0 till 4. I'll explain that more in just a bit. And there are reviewers, people who review these proposals and tell the entire committee if they think it's good. There's also this magic word which we have, which is consensus. Now, the important part about consensus, and we'll talk about it in just a bit, but consensus means that everybody in the committee needs to agree that a feature is useful in a certain way. So we don't have voting, we don't have any way to sort of resolve disagreement. Anybody who disagrees can basically stop something from happening. And this is special in many ways. So when do all of these things happen? There are quarterly meetings in TC39. They are for 4 days. They're in person. So we all decide a fun city to be in, say Moscow, but not Moscow because there's nobody who would bring us here. But for example, Tokyo. And we all go there and talk about boring stuff like JavaScript. There is lighter meetings in between, 2 consecutive quarterly meetings. So they're for 2 days and they're totally online. The in-person meetings, by the way, suspended right now because of the plague. So they're also online for now. There's monthly meetings for ECMA 402, which specifically go deeper into topics of internationalization. For example, the last one was on Thursday, and we talked about input masking and all these cool things. And there are other smaller, more focused meetings. For example, the SES group that Sergey was talking about have meetings themselves. And there is a meeting of people who are still deciding what to do with decorators. I think that meeting will go on forever. But yeah, they still have that. There's incubator calls, which are more focused calls that discuss a specific proposal. And at the end of the day, the most important point, there's GitHub. All the work happens at the end of the day on GitHub. It's always happening. And there's people working on stuff all the time, asynchronously. Next up, we have discourse. So just a quick show of hands. Does anybody know what discourse is? Have you ever used discourse? Thank you. Discourse is somewhat obscure, but it's a really cool platform. It's like a mailing list and also like a forum where you can discuss things. And there is a discourse for ECMAScript. So I'll show you there. And if you feel like talking about JavaScript to strangers and fight about it, feel free to visit there. How does all of this work? So as I was saying, there is no voting in TC39. Everybody needs to agree. We have a consensus-based decision-making model. So there is a number of people. Actually, there is a diverse set of people, as I can say, in the committee. So just to highlight how diverse the committee can be, there are people in the committee that represent Google, which happens to own a browser, but then also happens to own one of the biggest advertising businesses in the world. There is also people from IO, which build a tool called AdBlock Plus. So the advertisers and the ad blockers are all in the same committee, and they need to both agree that a certain feature is right for JavaScript. And this is just one of the different areas where we have this diversity. So ECMAScript tries to be diverse and have a lot of people that can represent their point of views. It also has a diverse set of people based on region, but yeah, as I was saying, there's not enough people from Russia participating, so it would be great to have some of you there. We work together to satisfy everybody's needs and goals. So there are objections and concerns, of course. Anything that you make can have objections by certain someone. But the important part is that all of these objections need to come with backing rationales. You can't just say, I don't like this, remove this feature. It's we do act like little kids, but not here. And so if somebody is working on something, they deserve to know why you dislike a particular thing, because then they can resolve it and design it in a way that avoids this issue. The important part here is that no stakeholder is kept over one another. A lot of people I meet think that TC39 or just JavaScript in specific is controlled entirely by browsers, and that browsers can decide whatever they want to do with the language. And that's just not true. The entire committee can decide and intervene, and there is no stakeholder which is more important than others. Google cannot decide for itself where the language will go. We have a basic rule of thumb, which is that we don't standardize things which aren't ready. We don't add things to the language which people do not agree with. There is, was it all? Okay, yeah. So talking about the stage process that I was telling you about, what are these different stages and what happens when a proposal goes through them? Stage 0 is called a straw person proposal. So do you know what a straw person is? A sort of stickman figure, and that's essentially what this is. It's just an idea. It might be in chat, it might be written down on a sheet of paper. It's just an idea. Any idea that you have for JavaScript is a stage 0 proposal. But that's not the end. You need to give this idea to the committee. So stage 1 is when it's actually called a proposal. It's presented to the committee, and then the committee decides if it's something that should be worked on, if it's a worthwhile goal. No other thing, just that the general idea is a good idea that we should investigate. Here we start describing the shape of a solution. So we say, okay, the idea was good, the problem that I identified was good, but let's now describe how a solution might look like. You also identify potential blockers. So you can say, okay, this solution is not good because it might have certain issues with it. I need to go down. Yeah, thank you. Then comes stage 2, which is when a proposal becomes a draft. Now you're starting to describe precise syntactic and semantic details of a proposal. You have to say, okay, this is the keyword that I'll use. This is the operator that I will use. This is how it will work, and so on. Then when we realize that we've discussed everything that we could discuss and the design is more or less complete and something that people agree on, it becomes a candidate feature. So it's stage 3, and this is when we realize, okay, we need feedback from implementers, from users, from actual people who use JavaScript and not just a bunch of people sitting in their chairs. So these features are then prototyped in different browsers. They become available behind flags and so on. And we get feedback from users and from people implementing them in these browsers. And then once we have enough feedback and once we have iterated on it, we call it finished. So stage 4 is when we add more tests for the feature, make sure that any future implementations actually implement it, and it becomes a part of the language. So it's no longer just a proposal. How do we build this consensus, though? At each stage, it might seem that there's a long and tedious, and believe me, it's tedious, process of getting people to agree with everybody. So these authors of any proposal, they develop the proposal with stakeholder input. So they're talking to different people who might want a particular feature, and they're talking to different communities, and they're getting their input, and they develop the proposal based on that. And the champion would then act as a bridge between the authors and TC39. So whatever the author decides or creates is put forward before the committee. The committee gives some response, which is brought back to the authors. Now, if the author is on the committee themselves, they might do it themselves. And so you could champion your own proposals, but you don't have to. And so if any of you are not on TC39 but would like to put forward a proposal, you know, 2 people at least who could be champions and who could help you put forward. Now, the fun part is that any aspects of the proposal may be discussed. So I might talk about how the proposal might work in the future and so on. And feedback may be given openly. But the concerns should be raised as early as possible so that the authors may work through this. And one more, please. Just a little bit below. Yes. But consensus always given as an indicator of the current stage. So I cannot say, I cannot look at a stage 1 proposal and say, okay, this will be impossible to implement in a browser. Let's not do this because it's not appropriate for the current stage. And vice versa. I cannot look at a stage 3 proposal and say, okay, this is horribly designed. Let's redo all of it because it's given as an indicator of the current stage and you cannot go back. A delegate may pose a constraint as necessary for advancement. So I might say, I like this feature, but I don't want it to violate any user privacy. I don't want it to reveal any personal identifying information. And actually, there's many delegates. So many delegates pose many constraints, and they're all with their own rationales, and the committee ends up making a trade-off. I might say, okay, this feature does reveal some user data, but then it makes writing applications much, much easier. So that may work. Stage 3 consensus, as I was telling you, is special because it implies completeness. It implies that the design is complete and that any design concern should be made before stage 3. This is important so that we don't make these browser engineers repeat their work over and over again and re-implement a feature many times. But enough boring stuff. Let's get to the meat of the talk. So let's take a deeper look into the stage process and see how these things pan out in reality. So first of all, do any of you have favorite proposals? Any takers? Any proposals? No? No favorite? OK. Then I'll just talk about my favorite proposals. I'm biased because I worked on this, but one of my favorite proposals is temporal. And temporal is a stage 3 proposal. Do any of you know what temporal is? Show of hands? Oh, yeah. Great. Thank you. Finally, people know. OK. Many problems with the legacy data object. To say the least, it's the most undesirable part of the JavaScript language. Actually, I say this fun thing. It predates myself. So the data object in JavaScript was added before I was born. And it was horrible when it was added. So it was horrible from the get-go. And there have been more than, 25 years, I think, with this monstrosity. And at some point, libraries started coming up, libraries like moment.js or date functions and so on. And I'm pretty sure that if any of you are writing applications that use dates and times, you're using at least one of those. It's impossible to build a application productively with just date. And these libraries try to ease the pain. I mean, it's not as horrible to use moment, but they have different level of effectiveness, and they're still, in most cases, not good enough. So a lot of stakeholders came together and decided that we need to fix this. We need to fix this at the language level, including people from the Moment team and people from different companies like Bloomberg and Google. Long discussion process happened, and we fought with each other for close to 2 years to go through the details. But we finally reached consensus. We finally reached an API that everybody was happy with. And a very diverse group of stakeholders were invested. For example, there were people from browsers, and there were people from who built calendar applications, and people who maintain these libraries, and so on. And we reached stage 3 in early 2021. So the implementations are ongoing. Actually, some of my colleagues are working with Apple and PlayStation to add it to Safari. So don't be surprised if this feature lands first in Safari and in WebKit. I know it sounds unbelievable, but this is the world that we live in. But yeah, all implementations are ongoing, and hopefully it will land in your favorite browser soon. Can I get a... OK. This looks convoluted, so maybe let's not go too deep into this. But just to give you an example, this function, actually generator function, called calculate daily occurrence, is doing something really, really special. It takes a time and a date, starting date, and a time zone. And it calculates the time of that event every day in that time zone. So if you see, first it iterates on 2 days, and then after a DST change happens, it changes the time. It respects the DST shift. And things like these are not easy to build in JavaScript today. So temporal makes this really easy by saying date.toZone_dateTime, and you convert it to an instant. Anyway, simple code. Hopefully make your life easier. Next up, one of my favorite stage 2 proposals is records and tuples. Do any of you know about records and tuples? Are you excited about them? So why records and tuples? Why do we need them? So records and tuples add new collection data types. There's 2 collection data types in JavaScript. There is a dictionary type collection type called plain object, and there is a list type collection type, which is array. Now, these are great. People love plain objects and arrays, but they have an obvious problem. These records and tuples are immutable versions of plain objects and arrays. But why immutable? I mean, yeah, immutable is great when you don't want to mutate, but what makes this special? Why is immutability a big benefit here? So it's beneficial because it adds compound types that are compared by value. So just a little context is that within programming languages, there are 2 types of comparison semantics, right? You can compare things based on their value, or you can compare things based on their reference. And now, compound types in JavaScript, the 2 that exist right now, they're only comparable by reference. So you can have 2 arrays that have the exact same contents, but they're not the same array. And if you try to equate them, that would evaluate to false. And now we're adding records and tuples where you can compare 2 tuples which have the same values, and that would evaluate to true. And this is special because it allows these compound types to be used in sets and maps. Until now, you could have sets and maps, but you could only use simple types like strings or numbers. Now you can use a list of different objects. So you can use a tuple. We also add a new function called JSON parse immutable, and it's just like JSON parse, but it parses things into records and tuples. This is, I am hoping, going to be really cool for parsing config data, for example, which you don't want to change. You want it to be exactly the same every time. We also have a literal syntax that is supported via a Babel plugin. I'll show you the literal syntax if we just progress the slides once. And can you? Okay, yeah, and there's the literal syntax. So here's that beloved symbol of ours. It's the whatever you call it, hash symbol, number symbol, and we had this for private fields. Now we also have this for records and tuples. And you can use this in a browser right away using Babel. Or you can wait. SpiderMonkey is implementing this, and hopefully it will also land in a browser soon. My favorite stage 1 proposal is decimal. Now this is, as we're going back the stages, these are getting more and more less well-defined proposals. So how many of you know about decimal, for example? Not many, not many. But some people are excited. And I'll tell you why they're excited. So number is an IEEE 754 64-bit float. I'm not rapping, but it's, why is this special? What does this even mean? It means that numbers are stored in 64 bits. So they can only have so much precision, and they're stored using this standard. And this standard includes base 2 fractions. So all these numbers are stored as base 2 fractions, but then base 2 fractions have this problem where they cannot represent things like 0.1 or 0.2 properly. So we had this joke, right, where people add a bunch of things, and then it's 0.300004, and it's a bit embarrassing. But the problem with base 10 is that base 10 cannot represent simple things like 1 by 3. So if you have 1 by 3 in base 10, what does that evaluate to? It's 0.33333, and it would not be able to perfectly be represented. So there's 3 data models that we can do to fix these issues. We can either have fractions in JavaScript, so we can store numerators and denominators separately, and that's how we can store these numbers in a reliable way. Now that has some issues with it, but it can work. We can have big decimal, which would be like big int, which is arbitrarily sized integers, but for decimals. Now that also has a problem. Or we can just have decimal 128, which is just the current number, but bigger, actually quite bigger, double the size. And it's special because WebAssembly has 128-bit floats, so it can work well with WebAssembly as well. Big decimal has the obvious problem, which is what should 1 by 3 be, right? If it's arbitrarily sized, you can take up the entire RAM of a person and still not represent 1 by 3 because it never ends. And a bunch of other things like pi. What about both? What about we add multiple variations and multiple ways to do this? And this is the thing with stage 1 proposals, is that we don't have a lot of clarity yet, and we still have a lot of work to be done. So if there's any proposals that you're interested in which are in this stage, it's a really nice place to start working on these proposals because things are still being actively worked out. Can you progress the slides? Thank you. This is just a simple example. We don't have to go through all of it, but it explains how you can calculate the bill of a number of items using big decimal. And yeah, big decimal would be really useful for mathematics, science, everything. But yeah, now that we're done talking about these proposals, what are the ways in which you can get involved? And what are the ways where if there's a lot more proposals, so you must have some favorites, or maybe not yet, but surely will have soon. What are the ways you can get in on the whole thing? You can go hang out in GitHub. As I said, most of our work goes on in GitHub. There is a Matrix chat, so not the movie, but do you know about Matrix? How many of you have any idea about Matrix chat? Matrix is not so many. Matrix is very cool. It's a decentralized federated chat application. Please try that out. There's Discourse, as I was telling. It's a forum where you can fight with other people about JavaScript, if that's your thing. Incubator calls that are about specific proposals that you might be interested in. There is a TC39 website that I'll show you in just a bit. And can you progress my slides? Yes, that is the TC39 website. It's translated to Russian if you prefer that. Yeah, and Sergey also did that. So you may also help him out with that and help translate the rest of the website in Russian. Then there is the Discourse. And on the Discourse, as you can see, there is a discussion about multilingual discussion. Unfortunately, this one is blocked on me, so I need to do some work. And hopefully, once I do that work, it will be possible to talk on Discourse and even Matrix, hopefully, in Russian and discuss JavaScript in Russian. Next up, we have TC39 outreach groups. So TC39 has a number of focus groups that we want to reach out to. This includes people who build tools and transpilers, different front-end frameworks, for example, educators. So a bunch of you might be educators, and we want to reach out to educators and figure out how people teach JavaScript. We work on educational material for JavaScript, which can be a problem. It's sometimes very hard to find good tutorials and so on. So we're always looking for people who can write such tutorials or who could popularize and maintain such tutorials. We have monthly calls for each of these, and we discuss ongoing TC39 proposals and how we can help from the sort of non-design side of things. How do you get involved is that there's issue trackers of any relevant proposal. So each proposal has its own GitHub repository. You can hang out in the issue tracker. You can tell people why they're wrong and try to fix their issues for them. You can contribute to documentation on MDN. So if you know, MDN is this amazing place where you can read documentation for anything, and you might contribute documentation to MDN. It's open to everyone. There's Discourse, of course, and you can file issues, create pull requests, and write tests. That is important. And this is the fun part. So if you work at a company, your employer can become a member of TC39. And this way, you get a lot more power and a lot more involvement than just being an individual. Or you can join as an invited expert if you care about a specific topic. If there's a specific topic that we work on that you care too much about and are consider yourself an expert in this, you may feel free to reach out to me, and we can add you to that. Okay, great, thank you. There is Test262, which is a repository that includes test suites, by the way, for the entire JavaScript language. So the entire JavaScript language is tested here, and any browser or implementation can run these tests to see if they implement JavaScript correctly. Once more, we have, which one is it? Oh, yeah, it's an example test. So some of the tests, I'm not sure if it's very visible, but some of the tests are really simple. And if you like writing tests and you want to write tests for the language itself, actually, if you see, it's mostly comments. And the test is just 2 lines. So you may feel free to contribute on this and let me know if you need any help with this. I think we have another. This is MDN. You're already hopefully familiar with it. And next up, we have this. This is the spec. This is how it's rendered. And if you see on the left, there's a table of contents which has everything. And you can read the spec yourself and try to see how JavaScript is specified and what people read to actually implement it. And that's it for me. Thank you.
We have few key questions on our website. Let me open it. So the first question is JavaScript or TypeScript?
No, no TypeScript. If you write TypeScript, I hate you automatically. No, I'm kidding. No, I like JavaScript because it runs everywhere and it's a standardized language that you can trust. TypeScript is great, but then it has different versions, and some version might break something, and you have to constantly change stuff. But at the end of the day, if you're writing TypeScript, you're still writing JavaScript. It's just compiling to JavaScript. So there's not a big difference. We're all friends.
Another question. What should I do to join TC39 without big tech company behind me, also without gold status via cash?
Yes. Okay. No money. Yeah. So as I was mentioning, you don't need to be working at a very big company in order to get involved in TC39. As a matter of fact, this is the whole reason why I'm here. There is a certain perception in the community that TC39 is a sort of separate group of people who decide what they think is best, and then everybody is supposed to just use what they produce. And that's not true. And I think if it is true to some extent, then we should fix it. So as an individual developer, as somebody who's just passionate about JavaScript, you may feel free to go through all of these issues and these different GitHub repositories that we have and talk to them. And I think it's very easy to get involved once you start discussing things. So just to give a quick example, in Temporal, we were designing a lot of stuff, but apparently we were designing stuff poorly. And this person comes along who files, I don't know, a lot of issues on the repo. And we realize, okay, we're wrong. And this person is telling us why. And we invited this guy, his name is Justin Rand, as an invited expert. Now he works with us and tells us, okay, this is not how developers write code. They're copying code from MDN or Stack Overflow. So build APIs in a way that helps the average developers and not just API that fulfills our sort of theoretical preferences.
Thank you. Next question. Is it possible to hold the TC39 meeting here in Russia or even in Moscow? For example, in collaboration with Russian IT company, Russian IT community and big tech companies?
That is so awesome. That is my dream. I have a bunch of amazing people I know a bunch of amazing people, you all, in Russia, and I know it's such an amazing place. And then I work with these people who I want to introduce to the community, and I think it would be awesome. Whoever sent this message, you may feel free to hit me up and we can figure out a way. But it would be really cool to have TC39 in Russia.
Thank you. Next question. Who is the customer of new features and how do TC39 prioritize them?
So there's essentially speaking, there's no customers of new features. These features are just requested by different stakeholders. They could be just people from the community, like, for example, the pipeline operator is just a popular thing among the community and they want it, or the decorator's proposal. And then there could be a specific company who's pushing for a certain feature. For example, Realms, which is a fairly new proposal, it was pushed for by Salesforce because it was important for them to be able to run arbitrary JavaScript code on their website. So you don't have to be a customer. You can, if you're a member of TC39, you can just go and make proposals. I think this is one of the best reasons for companies to join TC39. But even if you're not, you can do this in many ways. You can make your proposal and ask somebody to champion this. Hopefully, there will be at least one person on the committee who thinks your proposal is great, and they would help you with this. Otherwise, there is many ongoing proposals that you can work on and sort of redefine the scope of to include what you want to do.
Yeah, and it's not a question, but a little addition to last question. Thanks to Igalia for their contribution to community.
Thank you. Yeah.
And this was the last question from our website, so.
We actually have a question also here. Sorry, we'll start. I actually have a question which contains two parts. First part is just out of curiosity. I saw this complex process of making an idea into the feature that gets developed. Can you tell how much time it takes for the idea to become that?
Yes and no, because the time, because of this consensus process and the kind of feedback that you may get, this time really ranges from a couple of months, which we recently had. We had a new proposal called object.hasOwn that adds a new static function to the object, and this all happened within a span of a couple of months. So they presented at every meeting and they were progressing at every meeting, and it was done really quickly because everybody agreed it was a great idea. On the other hand, there can be controversial proposals like decorators, which can take an infinite amount of time. I think we joke about how we might not be able to see decorators in JavaScript in our lifetime, but maybe our children would. There can also be proposals like Realms that I was talking about, which was stalled for many, many years because just nobody was willing to work on it. But then at a later point, somebody came along who said, okay, I'll work on this and I'll make sure that this happens. And then it took a long time, but now it's there. And then there's proposals like Temporal, which have a big team of people working on it constantly. And everybody is positive, but it's such a big feature that just the sheer size of the proposal makes it that it takes over 2 years to finish.
Okay, thank you. And the second part is, you as a delegate, do you find the process of developing the standard overly complex? And would you like to change something, for example, how the community is involved or the ways that the community gets involved?
Yes. I think it's too complex sometimes, especially when I'm working through these things. Right now, I'm traveling and I'm meeting people. So I say, okay, I love the process. It's great. And it is theoretically. But when you're practically in there, you're working every day to design a feature. And then somebody comes along 2 months later and says that you should do it entirely from scratch. It's very frustrating. But truth be told, when I think about it, I still think that it's for the best of everybody. Realms is a great example about how things can be blocked for such a long time, and then somebody comes along with a better idea, and then that idea would just work. And so, for example, in Realms, there was this issue where how isolated should different realms be? Should they be able to exchange objects? If so, then they're not secure enough. And if they are not able to share anything, then they are just completely useless because you cannot pass anything in between. And the fun thing that we did with Realms was that somebody came up with the idea of a callable boundary. So you can share references to functions between two realms, and then one realm can call functions inside another realm, but then not exchange data, just function calls. So you basically have RPC on different execution contexts. So I think, boring example, but the point is that when we spend this much time and blood, sweat, and tears on proposals, they hopefully improve for the better. Hopefully we see different ideas and different things forming that make the feature in a way that was previously unthinkable. So I think it's long, but it helps us do things when they're ready and not do them too fast, because in JavaScript you cannot remove anything. So once it's there, and it's better to not ship unfinished stuff than have something you're stuck with.
Okay, thank you again for the report.
Thank you, and we are out of time. Thank you, Ujjwal. You can talk with Ujjwal here.